Why is this video necessary for newcomers? It's because even after 28 years of its existence, UFC, aka Ultimate Fighting Championship, is still not as widely recognized as the NFL or the NBA. So, in today's video, we're going to talk about the most confusing, absurd, and even address the downright dumb questions about the UFC. Question number 1. Why isn't the UFC banned? Given how violent the sport can be, people who are on the outside looking in can't help but wonder, why is this even legal? Several decades ago, way before Dana White and the Fertitta brothers took over, MMA was outlawed in multiple American states. The sport had a lot of political adversaries, the most notable one being former Arizona Senator John McCain. The story goes that McCain, an avid boxing fan, took notice of the sport after watching a tape and did not like what he saw. In turn, he became the torchbearer for politicians desiring to ban the sport of MMA. It wasn't until Zuffa took over the UFC that the sport underwent a massive image rehabilitation. The UFC introduced new rules and regulations to make it more palatable to the masses. By the early 2000s, Zuffa presented the UFC as a professional contest rather than human cockfighting, as McCain dubbed it. Fortunately, the sport survived through the internet, tape trading, and a few satellite and cable companies that carried MMA pay-per-views. Question number 2. Are UFC fighters on steroids? Steroids, or performance-enhancing drugs, are illegal in MMA, just like any other professional sport. At the moment, the UFC has a comprehensive and transparent drug testing program in place, which is facilitated by the United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA. USADA is responsible for testing the UFC fighters randomly during pre-fight and post-fight periods. The results of said tests are then disclosed to the public, meaning anyone who's on the juice would get exposed and punished accordingly. However, USADA has only partnered with the UFC since July 2015. Prior to that, MMA was a wild sport, much like that of the Wild West when it comes to steroid use. Which fighters competed with honesty, and which ones borrowed a little something from the end of a needle? Your guess is as good as ours. Although it's fair to say that some fighters are more obvious juicers than others. Alistair Overeem, Vitor Belfort. Question number 3. Who is the best UFC fighter? This question is one of the most hotly debated topics in the community, and the answer varies depending on who you'd ask. The majority of UFC fans believe that former longtime UFC light heavyweight champion Jon Jones is the greatest of all time. However, an argument can be made that Jones's multiple failed drug tests disqualify him from being considered the GOAT. For that reason alone, some portion of the MMA community backs Georges St-Pierre's claim as the GOAT. The French-Canadian icon who ruled the UFC welterweight division with an iron fist had an incredible career. Despite that, fans believe GSP lacked the finishes to be considered the best, even though he attained double champ status later on. Another popular answer is Anderson Silva, who mesmerized the world when he was at the peak of his powers. The case against Silva is that he amassed several losses on his way out of the octagon. We can go round and round debating who the MMA GOAT is, but at the end of the day, the answer is really subjective. Question number 4. How much do UFC fighters make? Just like any other sport or profession, the amount a UFC fighter earns depends on several factors, including skill, popularity, the ability to generate income for the company, out of the sport sponsorship, and more. With that in mind, there are 3 salary tiers that a UFC fighter can fall into: low, medium, and high. The lowest earners take home anywhere between $10,000 to $30,000, while the highest paid fighters can rake in between $500,000 and $3 million per fight. A fighter's payout can also increase through performance bonuses that are handed out after each and every card. This system is in place to motivate fighters to go for the finish or put on exciting performances. In case you were wondering, several UFC fighters, even ones who are at the top 10 of their divisions, are forced to keep their day jobs despite being in the world's largest MMA promotion. For every millionaire like Conor McGregor, there are hundreds of Sarah Alpar, who struggles to pay for their training camp, and dozens of Jeff Neal, who still keeps his 9-to-5 to make ends meet. Question number 5. Is the UFC real? The legitimacy of UFC fighting is something that gets questioned now and then. This is mainly due to the similarities it has with professional wrestling. Of course, pro wrestling is more theater than sport, as the promoters and storytellers control the narrative. but the UFC is a whole other beast. Sure, MMA and pro wrestling still share the same business models when it comes to promoting their fights. But at the end of the day, the outcome of the fights in the UFC falls on the shoulders of the fighters and their own merits. That's not to say that MMA matchmakers don't dabble in the occasional predetermining of fights, but they don't do it by asking fighters to take a dive. Instead, up-and-coming prospects are sometimes given favorable matchups to help them rise through the ranks. Take Paddy Pimblett, for example. It's in the UFC's best interest for the lightweight star to succeed, which is why he's being served opponents he's capable of beating handily. However, that's about as far as matchmaking favor is concerned. So in short, the UFC, as it loves to tell its fans over and over, is as real as it gets. And that's it for our list. Like and share if you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to follow Sportskeeda MMA on all of our social media platforms.